The bread was going to burn. Penny knew it the moment she smelled the first thread of smoke curling up from the stone hearth. But her hands were buried wrist-deep in a bucket of cold water, scrubbing the grime from a copper pot that weighed nearly as much as she did. She pulled her hands free, shook them once, and crossed the kitchen in 3 quick steps, using the corner of her linen apron to drag the clay pan back from the fire's edge. She exhaled. The loaves were dark along the bottom, but not ruined. Not yet. Around her, the castle kitchens churned with the usual morning chaos. The clatter of iron ladles against stone pots. The thick smell of rendered fat and dried rosemary. The shouts of the head cook, Master Aldrich, whose voice could silence a crowded great hall when he chose. Steam rose in heavy columns from the boiling cauldrons. The scullery boys moved in darting lines between the workbenches, carrying platters and clay jugs and baskets of root vegetables still dusted with dark earth from the cellars below. Penny moved among them like water through stone. Quiet, efficient, invisible. That was the art of being an Omega in the castle of Valen Duskmore, Alpha King of Varenhold. You learned to take up as little space as possible. You learned to finish your work before anyone noticed it had not yet been done. You learned to keep your eyes down, your voice low, and your opinions entirely to yourself. She was 23 years old, and she had been a castle servant since she was old enough to carry a bucket without spilling it. She had no rank, no family name that carried weight, no wolf strong enough to shift without effort and pain. Her hair was pale gold, braided thick over one shoulder, and her eyes were the soft gray of a winter sky just before snow, eyes that noticed everything and gave away nothing. She wore a plain linen dress the color of old cream, a leather belt cinched at her waist, and a gray woolen cloak she had mended so many times the patches now had patches of their own. Her boots were worn at the heel, but solid. She had learned long ago that solid boots mattered more than pretty ones. Penny. Master Aldrich's voice cut through the noise without effort. The king's morning tray, now. She was already moving. The tray was prepared with the careful precision that the king's service demanded. A clay bowl of spiced porridge, a wooden board with soft cheese and dried fruit, a small iron pot of black tea steeped exactly long enough, and a folded square of clean linen. Penny lifted it, balanced it against her forearm, and left the kitchens through the narrow servants' passage that ran along the castle's inner wall like a hidden vein. The passage was cold. The stone sweated with morning damp, and her breath came in small white clouds as she climbed the tight spiral stair toward the upper keep. The tray was heavy. She kept her eyes on the steps. She was not supposed to deliver to the king's private study. That task belonged to Rona, the senior Omega attendant who had served the upper floors for 11 years. But Rona had woken that morning with a fever that left her shaking beneath her blankets, and there was no one else. Master Aldrich had looked at Penny the way people look at tools that are available, without particular thought, and pointed. So here she was. The upper keep was a different world from the kitchens. The floors were covered in heavy woven rugs. The candle sconces along the walls held real beeswax candles, not the tallow stubs that lit the servants' quarters. The air smelled of old parchment and pine resin and something darker beneath. Something wild and ancient that Penny had learned to associate with alphas of great power. It was not an unpleasant smell. It was simply a reminder of where she stood in the order of things. She reached the study door and stopped. It was open. Not fully. Perhaps 2 handspans. But enough that the firelight inside spilled in a warm stripe across the stone floor of the corridor. Penny raised her free hand to knock on the doorframe. And then she heard the voice. "Tell me the truth, Gareth, or I will hear it from someone else and like it considerably less." The voice was low, measured, carrying the particular quiet of a man who had learned that volume was unnecessary when authority was absolute. Penny's hand stilled against the wood. "My king." A second voice, older, rougher. "The Lady Seraphine has been informed of the betrothal terms. She has accepted them. The ceremony..." I did not ask about the ceremony. A pause, the sound of something heavy being set down on a table. I asked whether she had agreed of her own will. Another pause, longer this time. She has agreed, my king. Penny became aware, with a cold drop of unease in her stomach, that she had been standing in the corridor long enough to have heard things she was not meant to hear. She lifted her hand again, this time with the intention of knocking firmly, announcing herself, and retreating as quickly as dignity and a full tray would allow. She knocked. The silence inside the study changed quality entirely. Enter. Penny pushed the door open with her shoulder, keeping the tray balanced, and stepped inside. The study was large and warm, the hearth at its far wall stacked high with burning pine logs that crackled and spat amber light across the room. Shelves of heavy bound volumes lined 3 walls. Maps were spread across the central table, weighted at their corners with iron discs. Candles burned in clusters on every flat surface. 2 men stood near the table. One was Gareth Holt, the king's senior advisor, a gray-bearded man in dark robes, whose expression when he saw Penny shifted immediately to polite dismissal. He was beta, practical, observant. His eyes moved from her face to the tray and back. The other was King Valen Duskmore. Penny had seen him before, in the way that servants saw the king, at a distance, in procession, surrounded by guards and nobles, and the careful architecture of ceremony. She had never been this close. He was taller than she had understood from a distance. His dark hair fell in long braids past his shoulders, threaded with iron rings near the ends. His eyes were the deep, unsettling blue of a frozen lake, the kind of blue that seemed to hold light rather than reflect it. He wore a leather vest reinforced with dark iron buckles, a fur mantle across his broad shoulders, and bracers of worn leather at his wrists. There was a scar at the corner of his jaw, old and thin, and another visible on his left forearm where the bracer didn't cover. He was looking at her, not the way people looked at servants, through them, past them, at the wall behind. He was looking at her, directly, with an attention that felt like weight. Penny kept her eyes down, crossed to the table, and began to set the tray beside the maps, with careful, quiet movements. "You are not Rona," the king said. "No, my king." Her voice came out steady. She was grateful for that. "Rona is unwell this morning. Master Aldrich sent me in her place. I apologize for the disruption." She finished arranging the tray, straightened, and turned to leave. "What is your name?" She stopped. It was not unusual for lords to ask servants their names. It was unusual for the question to be asked in that particular tone. Not commanding, not idle, genuinely asking. "Penny, my king. I serve in the lower kitchens." She did not look up. She kept her hands folded in front of her and waited for the dismissal. It did not come immediately. When she finally allowed herself to glance up, because the silence had stretched long enough that not looking began to feel stranger than looking, she found him still watching her. There was something in his expression she could not name. Not curiosity, exactly. Not suspicion. Something quieter and more unsettling than either. "You may go," he said at last. She dipped her head and left. In the corridor, with the door closed behind her and the cold stone pressing against her back, Penny stood very still for a moment and breathed. Her heart was beating faster than it should have been for such a simple errand. She told herself it was the stairs. She told herself that, and walked back down toward the kitchens, where the bread was waiting and the fire needed tending, and the world made the kind of sense she understood. She did not think about frozen blue eyes. She tried very hard not to. 3 days passed before Penny saw him again. In those 3 days, life in the lower kitchens continued its relentless rhythm. Fires lit before dawn, water hauled from the castle well in heavy wooden buckets, vegetables chopped and boiled and served, and the whole cycle begun again before the previous one had fully ended. Rona recovered from her fever by the second day, but remained pale and slow, so Penny quietly absorbed the extra work without complaint, the way she had always absorbed things that fell through the cracks around her. She did not think about the study. She did not think about the question asked in a tone she could not quite categorize, or the silence that had followed her name, as though the king were turning it over in his mind, like a coin of uncertain origin. She thought about bread and water temperature, and whether the castle's stores of dried thyme would last through the winter. It was on the third evening, when the great hall had been cleared and the kitchen fires were banked low, that everything changed. Penny had been sent to the upper larder, a narrow stone room on the second floor of the east wing, where the finer provisions were kept under lock and key. Master Aldrich needed a particular jar of preserved plums for the morning's noble breakfast, and the boy he'd sent had returned empty-handed, claiming he couldn't find it. Penny took the key from the hook without a word, and went herself. The east wing at night was hushed and dim, the corridor lit only by the scattered glow of candles set in iron wall brackets. The larder was at the far end of the passage, past a row of closed doors that belonged to minor noble guests, currently housed in the castle. Penny walked quickly, her boots soft on the stone, the key warm in her palm. She found the plums without difficulty, third shelf behind the quince preserves, exactly where they should have been. She was turning to leave, jar tucked under her arm, when she heard the sound. It was not a loud sound. That was what stopped her. A small voice, barely more than a breath, coming from behind the door directly across the corridor from the larder. Penny stood still and listened. It came again, a thin, high sound, the unmistakable sound of a child crying very quietly. The kind of crying that happens when someone has learned that crying loudly brings consequences. She crossed the corridor and pressed her fingers lightly against the door. It swung inward, unlocked. The room beyond was small and cold. No fire had been laid in the hearth, and the single tallow candle on the windowsill had burned down to a nub, filling the room with dim, wavering light. There was a narrow bed against the far wall, a wooden chest, and a small table with a half-eaten bowl of gray porridge gone cold and stiff. Sitting on the edge of the bed, wrapped in a blanket far too thin for the chill in the air, was a child. A girl, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, with dark tangled hair and wide brown eyes, red-rimmed from crying. She wore a plain woolen dress that was slightly too large, and scuffed leather shoes that had not been cleaned in some time. When she saw Penny, she went perfectly still. The stillness of a small creature that has learned stillness is safer than movement. Penny kept her voice very gentle. "Hello, are you all right?" The girl stared at her, said nothing. Penny looked around the room with the quick, practical eye of someone who had spent years identifying what was missing from a space. No water, no warmth, cold food. A child alone, in an unlocked room in the east wing, crying quietly in the dark. "Are you cold?" Penny asked. A small nod. "What is your name?" A long pause, then, barely above a whisper. "Mira. Mira." Penny set the jar of plums down on the table. "Where is your guardian? Who brought you here?" The girl's eyes moved to the door, then back to Penny, in a way that said clearly she did not know whether the woman standing before her was safe or not. Penny recognized that look. She had worn it herself at that age, in rooms not unlike this one. She crossed to the hearth, found a small stack of firewood beside it that had not been used, and began to lay a fire. Her hands moved efficiently, striking the flint and catching the spark in a nest of dried bark. By the time the first small flame took hold, the girl had shifted slightly on the bed, not closer, but less rigidly away. "You don't have to tell me anything," Penny said, feeding a thin piece of wood to the growing flame. "But I'd like to know you're safe." "The Lord said to stay here," the girl said at last. Her voice was small but precise. "Until the king decides." Penny's hands stilled on the firewood, Which lord? The girl pulled the blanket tighter and looked at the floor. Lord Cassian. He brought me from the village. He said the king would want to see me. He said... She stopped. Her jaw tightened with the particular determination of a child trying not to cry again. He said my parents owed a debt. The fire had caught properly now, the flames beginning to push warmth into the cold air. Penny sat back on her heels and looked at the child, the thin dress, the cold porridge, the unlocked door through which anything or anyone could have entered. Something settled in her chest. Not anger. Something quieter and more durable than anger. She stood, picked up the jar of plums and opened it. She broke off a piece of the dark preserved fruit and held it out. After a moment, Mira took it with careful fingers and ate it with the focused intensity of someone who had not eaten enough today. Penny was still deciding what to do next when she heard footsteps in the corridor. Not the light step of a servant. Heavy, deliberate, unhurried. The footsteps of a man who had never needed to move quietly, because the world arranged itself around him, rather than the other way around. The door, which Penny had left ajar, swung fully open. King Valen Duskmore stood in the doorway. He was not in formal dress. No court mantle, no ceremonial sword at his belt. He wore a plain dark tunic and leather trousers. His braided hair loosened slightly from its daytime order, 2 braids framing his face and the rest falling free behind his shoulders. He looked in that unguarded moment less like a king and more like a man who had been walking through his castle at night because sleep had not come and corridors were better than ceilings. His gaze moved across the room in a single sweep. The cold hearth now burning. The child on the bed with a piece of plum halfway to her mouth. Penny crouching beside the fire with soot on her fingers, and the jar of preserves open on the table behind her. His expression was unreadable. Then his eyes dropped to the bowl of cold gray porridge on the table, and something shifted in his face. It was brief, barely a flicker. But Penny, who had spent her entire life reading the small signals of people with power over her, caught it. His jaw tightened. A muscle moved in his neck. He looked at Penny. "Did you light that fire?" he asked. "Yes, my king." She rose to her feet. The child was cold. I found her alone. I thought... "Who told you to come to this room?" "No one. I was retrieving provisions from the larder across the hall. I heard..." She paused, choosing her words with care. "I heard that she needed help." Another silence. The fire crackled between them. Mira had gone completely still on the bed, the piece of plum held forgotten in her small fist, her wide eyes moving between the king and Penny with the careful attention of a child trying to understand whether the large man in the doorway was dangerous. Valen looked at the girl for a long moment. Something moved in his expression. Not the flicker of irritation she had expected, not the cold assessment of a king evaluating a problem. Something older and less easily named. "Mira," he said. His voice, when he spoke to the child, was not soft exactly, but it was different, lower, without the particular resonance of command. "Are you hungry?" The girl considered this with great seriousness, then nodded. He turned to Penny. "Stay with her," he said. "I will send someone with a proper meal and a warmer blanket. And I want Lord Cassian in the great hall before the morning bell." This last part he said more quietly, almost to himself, in a tone that made the hair on Penny's arms rise despite the growing warmth of the fire. He looked at her once more before he left, just briefly. The way he had looked at her in the study, as though he were seeing something he had not expected and had not yet decided what to do with. Then he was gone, his footsteps fading down the corridor toward the main keep. Penny let out a slow breath and turned back to the fire. Mira was watching her. "Is he angry?" the girl asked. "Not at you," Penny said. She picked up another piece of plum and handed it across. Mira took it, and this time something small and fragile loosened in her expression. Not quite trust. but the first careful consideration of it. Penny sat down on the edge of the bed beside her, close enough for warmth, and watched the fire burn. She did not know what Lord Cassian had done, or what debt he had collected a child to settle. She did not know why the king had been walking this corridor at this hour, or what he had felt when he had seen that cold gray porridge. She did not know why he had looked at her the way he did, but she knew the fire was burning now, and the child was not alone. For tonight, that was enough. The Lord who collected debts in children. Morning came to Varenhold Castle the way it always did in the deep of autumn. Slowly, reluctantly, the gray light pressing through the narrow leaded windows like something that had traveled a long distance and arrived exhausted. The torches in the great hall had been relit before dawn, and the long stone room smelled of pine smoke and cold air, and the particular tension that gathers in a space where powerful people are about to say difficult things. Penny should not have been there. She knew that clearly, in the practical part of her mind that had always kept her out of trouble by keeping her invisible. She was a kitchen omega. The great hall during a formal audience was no place for her. She had delivered Mira to the care of Rona, now recovered and deeply alarmed by the situation, and should have returned to her workbench and her bread and her copper pots. Instead, she stood in the narrow servants' gallery above the great hall, pressed against the stone wall behind a tapestry that smelled of dust and old wool, and watched. Below, King Valen sat in the high carved chair at the head of the hall. He had not changed from the night before into ceremonial dress. He wore the same dark tunic, the same worn leather, the fur mantle added back across his shoulders against the morning cold. His braided hair was fully ordered again, the iron rings catching the torchlight. His posture was utterly still, the particular stillness of a predator that has decided to wait. Beside him stood Gareth Holt, arms folded into his dark robes, expression carefully neutral in the way of a man who has witnessed many of these mornings and survived them all by remaining precisely neutral. Across the hall, Lord Cassian had been brought in. Penny had seen Lord Cassian before only at a distance, during feasts. A broad man, richly dressed, with the florid complexion and easy confidence of someone who had spent his life collecting power in small amounts and hoarding it carefully. He wore deep burgundy wool today, trimmed with brown fur, and a heavy gold chain at his collar. He was smiling when he entered. The smile faded quickly when he took in the king's expression. Lord Cassian. Valen's voice carried to every corner of the hall, without effort or volume. Tell me about the child. Cassian spread his hands in a gesture of practiced reasonableness. My king, the matter is simple. The girl's father is a tenant on my eastern lands. He accumulated a debt, grain borrowed across 2 bad harvests, seed that was never repaid. When the debt reached a sum he could not settle in coin or labor, I accepted the girl as collateral, as is my right under the old compact. Collateral, Valen repeated. Temporary, of course. Until the debt is... She is 6 years old. The words were quiet. That was what made them land so heavily. There was no shout, no theatrical anger. Just those 4 words, placed in the air of the hall like stones dropped into still water. Cassian's smile had entirely disappeared now. My king, the old compact permits. The old compact, Valen said, was written by men who had never sat in a cold room and watched a child eat preserved plums because no one had thought to send her a proper meal. He paused. I sat in a room like that once. I remember what the cold tastes like. Silence. Gareth's expression, Penny noted from the gallery, did not change, but his hands, folded inside his robes, tightened briefly. The debt is dissolved, the king said. The girl will be returned to her family today, with an escort. Her father's tenancy is transferred to the crown at standard rate, which means Lord Cassian no longer has claim over those lands or anyone on them. He looked at Cassian with those frozen lake eyes. And you will explain to me, before you leave this hall, how many other children you are currently holding as collateral on your estates. The color drained from Lord Cassian's florid face. What followed was not pleasant, and Penny stayed long enough to understand that it would have consequences that rippled far beyond one cold room and one small girl. Then she slipped back from the gallery before anyone could notice her presence, descended the servants' stair, and returned to the kitchens. Master Aldrich looked at her when she entered. His gaze dropped to her face, then to her hands, then back to her face with the expression of a man who has decided not to ask a question he can already see the shape of. "The plums," he said. "In the larder," Penny said. "Third shelf. I left the jar open. I'll replace it from stores." He nodded and turned back to the fire. She did not expect to be summoned. It came mid-morning, a young royal guard in dark leather, appearing at the kitchen door with the slightly uncomfortable expression of a man accustomed to barracks and battlements, suddenly standing among hanging herbs and boiling pots. He asked for Penny by name. Master Aldrich looked at her. She dried her hands on her apron and followed. She was brought not to the great hall and not to the study, but to a small antechamber off the main corridor of the upper keep, a room with 2 chairs, a table, a narrow window looking out over the castle's inner yard, and a fire burning low in the grate. The kind of room designed for conversations that were not quite private enough for a study, but not public enough for a hall. Gareth Holt was waiting for her. He was alone, standing beside the window with his arms folded, looking out at the gray yard below. When she entered, he turned and studied her with the methodical attention of a man cataloging information. "Sit," he said, not unkindly. She sat. He remained standing, which she understood was deliberate. "You were in the East Wing last night," he said. "You found the child, lit the fire, stayed with her until she was settled. You were in the servants' gallery this morning during the audience with Lord Cassian." It was not a question. Penny folded her hands in her lap and said nothing. "I am not here to punish you," Gareth said. His voice had the dry precision of a man who had spent decades choosing his words in rooms where words had consequences. "I am here because the king asked me to speak with you." That surprised her. She kept it off her face. "He wants to know why you stayed with the child." Penny considered the question. "Because she was afraid," she said, "and cold, and alone." That describes many people in many rooms across this kingdom on any given night. "Yes," Penny agreed. "But she was the one in front of me." Gareth looked at her for a long moment. His expression remained carefully neutral, but something behind his eyes shifted. A small recalibration, like a scale settling to a new balance point. "The king has decided that the child will remain in the castle for a few days before her return home," he said, "to ensure she has recovered properly. He has asked that you be assigned to her care during that time, if you are willing." Penny blinked. In her experience, being asked if she was willing was unusual. Most assignments arrived as instructions. "I am willing," she said. Gareth nodded slowly. Then, in a different tone, quieter, less official, "You should know, Penny of the lower kitchens, that what you did last night was noticed. Not only the fire or the food, the way the child looked at you when the king entered the room." He paused. "She was not afraid. Because of you, she was not afraid." He moved toward the door. Stopped. "The king does not forget things he notices," he said. "That is worth knowing." He left. Penny sat alone in the antechamber for a moment, the fire ticking quietly beside her, the sounds of the castle yard drifting up through the narrow window. The cold air carried the smell of hay and horses and distant wood smoke. She thought about what Gareth had said, about the king's words in the great hall. "I sat in a room like that once. I remember what the cold tastes like." She thought about a man who wore his authority like armor, and had chosen, in a room with no audience to perform for, to speak to a frightened child in a voice stripped of command. She thought about frozen blue eyes seeing her, actually seeing her. And then, because she was Penny, and she had survived 23 years by being practical above all things, she stood up, straightened her apron, and went to find Mira. The child was in a proper room now, warm, with a real fire, and a bed with 2 blankets and a breakfast tray that had been sent up with conspicuous care. She was sitting cross-legged on the bed when Penny arrived, turning a smooth river stone over and over in her small hands with the focused, private attention that children bring to objects that comfort them. She looked up when Penny entered. "You came back," Mira said, as though this were both a surprise and something she had been quietly hoping for. "I said I would," Penny said. She sat down in the chair beside the bed. "How is the breakfast?" "The porridge is warm," the girl said. This was delivered with great significance. "Good," Penny said, and meant it entirely. Outside, the wind had picked up, pressing cold against the leaded glass of the window. Below in the yard, she could hear the clatter of horses being readied, Mira's escort, she assumed, being assembled. But that would not be today. Today the child was warm and fed and not alone. That was enough. What Penny did not see, and would not know until much later, was that across the corridor from the room she now sat in, a door stood slightly ajar. And on the other side of that door, King Valen Duskmore stood with one hand braced on the frame, looking at nothing in particular, listening to the sound of a woman's steady voice reassuring a small girl that the world contained people worth trusting. His jaw was tight, his eyes were distant. He stayed there for longer than he would ever admit. What loyalty looks like from the inside. The days that followed moved differently than any Penny had known in the castle. She still rose before dawn. She still carried water and tended fires, and worked the long hours that servant life demanded without ceremony or complaint. But somewhere between the morning kitchen and the afternoon, she was expected in Mira's room. And that small daily appointment changed the texture of everything around it in ways she could not fully explain. Mira was a quiet child, but not a sad one. She had the particular inner life of a child who had spent significant time alone and had built something rich and self-sustaining inside that solitude. She collected things, smooth stones, interesting feathers, a piece of blue glass she had found in the courtyard, and which she kept wrapped in a scrap of cloth as though it were precious metal. She told Penny the names of these objects with great seriousness, and Penny listened with equal seriousness, because she understood that this was important. On the 3rd day, Mira asked about the braids in Penny's hair. "My mother taught me," Penny said, her hands working a loose thread back into her apron hem. "When I was small, smaller than you." "Where is she now?" "She died when I was 8. Penny said it plainly, without performance. It was a cold winter. Many people in our village were ill. Mira turned her river stone over in her hands. "My mother cries sometimes when she thinks I cannot hear her." She paused. "I think she is crying now." "I think she probably is," Penny agreed. "And I think she will stop when she sees you again. People cry less when the thing they were afraid of losing is back in front of them." Mira considered this with the careful philosophical attention she brought to most statements. Then she nodded, apparently finding it satisfactory, and asked Penny to show her how to do the braid. They were sitting like that, Penny's fingers working through the girl's dark, tangled hair, both of them on the edge of the bed in the warm, firelit room, when the door opened. Penny heard it and assumed it was Rona with the afternoon meal. She did not look up immediately. "She said her mother taught her," Mira announced to the room. "Did she?" Penny's hands stilled. She turned her head. King Valen stood just inside the doorway, still in his riding clothes, dark leather coat dusty at the shoulders, boots carrying the dried mud of the outer roads, his braided hair slightly disordered by wind. He had clearly come directly from outside the castle walls, and he had clearly come here first, before changing, before any of the other things a returned king would normally do. He was looking at the two of them with that expression Penny had started to recognize, the one she still could not fully name. Not soft, exactly. Not guarded. Something in between that had no clean word attached to it. "You were outside the castle," Penny said, then immediately understood that was an absurd thing to say to the King of Varenhold, as though she were noting something he might not have been aware of. She straightened. "My king, forgive me. I rode to the eastern border this morning," he said. He did not seem bothered by her observation. He moved into the room and crouched down to Mira's level with the unhurried ease of a large man who had made the conscious choice to make himself smaller. "How are you, Mira?" "My hair is being fixed," the girl said. "So I see." The faintest trace of something, not quite a smile, but its shadow, moved at the corner of his mouth. "Does it feel better?" Mira reached up and touched the half-finished braid with her fingertips. "It's not done yet." He looked at Penny. "Then perhaps you should finish." Penny realized she was still sitting with her hands in midair and brought them back to Mira's hair. Her fingers resumed their work without her consciously telling them to. Valen straightened and moved to stand near the window, looking out at the castle yard below. The afternoon light was pale and thin, the sky the color of old pewter. He stood with his arms folded, his back not quite to the room, in the posture of a man who was present without intending to take up space. "The escort is ready," he said. "She can return to her family tomorrow if she wishes." Mira's small shoulders tightened slightly under Penny's hands. The girl did not say anything. "Or," the king continued, without turning from the window, "she may wait another day if she needs more time." The shoulders loosened. "Another day," Mira said. "Another day," he agreed. Penny tied off the braid with a strip of ribbon Rona had left on the table and sat back. Mira immediately reached up to feel the finished work with both hands, with the concentrated satisfaction of someone receiving exactly what they had needed. "It is straight?" she asked Penny. "Very straight," Penny confirmed. Mira twisted to look at the king. "Do you have someone to fix your hair?" The silence that followed this question was brief, but complete. Penny pressed her lips together to hold back the expression that wanted to cross her face. "I manage it myself," Valen said. "That's why some of it is crooked," Mira said, straightforwardly, with no particular malice. This time the shadow at the corner of Valen's mouth became something definite, brief, and quickly set aside, but undeniably real. He turned from the window and looked at Penny with those blue eyes, and she found that the expression in them, that unnameable something, had shifted slightly, warmer at the edges, less carefully maintained. "You have my thanks," he said, "for the care you have given her." "I did not do it for thanks," Penny said. And then, because the words had already left her mouth and could not be recalled, "I did not mean that dismissively. I only meant I would have done it regardless." He studied her for a moment. "I know," he said. "That is exactly why I am thanking you." He left. Penny sat in the chair beside the bed and looked at the fire for a long while after his footsteps had faded down the corridor. It was Rona who first said it out loud. She came to collect the afternoon tray and stayed longer than necessary, setting cups and plates with the deliberate slowness of a woman who had something on her mind and was working up to saying it. Mira had fallen asleep in the chair by the fire, the river stone tucked against her cheek, her new braid already starting to loosen at the bottom. "The king came again," Rona said. It was not a question. "He came to see Mira," Penny said. Rona looked at her with the patient, slightly tired expression of a woman who had worked the upper floors for 11 years and had seen most things. She was perhaps 15 years older than Penny, solid, brown-haired, practical, with the particular competence of someone who had survived long service by understanding people accurately. "He came yesterday, too," Rona said, "and the day before, each time during the hours he knew you would be here." She picked up a cup, examined it, set it back down. "I find that interesting." "He comes to see Mira," Penny said again, more firmly. "He does," Rona agreed. "And when Mira is asleep, he stays anyway." She finally looked up. "I am not saying this to cause you difficulty. I am saying it because I like you, Penny. And I know this castle better than you do. And there are people in it who will not find it interesting in the way that I find it interesting." Penny was quiet for a moment. "What people?" "Lady Seraphine arrives in 5 days," Rona said simply, "with her father's retinue. The betrothal is formal. The ceremony is planned for the new moon." She picked up the tray. "She is an alpha daughter from the northern coast, beautiful, powerful, and she has been told she will be Queen of Varenhold." She moved toward the door, then paused. "I am telling you what I know," she said quietly, "not what you should do with it. That is for you to decide." She left. Penny sat in the warmth of the room and listened to Mira's soft, even breathing and the fire's small conversation with itself. Outside, the wind had picked up again, moving through the castle's stones with a low, persistent sound, like something trying to find a way in. She thought about what she had said to the king. "I would have done it regardless." And his answer, quiet, certain, "I know." She thought about Rona's words, "He stays anyway." And she thought about a betrothal and a ceremony, and a woman arriving in 5 days who had been promised a crown. She was a kitchen omega, with patched boots, and a gray cloak that had been mended too many times. She had no rank, no family name, no position in any world that contained kings and alliances, and the careful architecture of power. She knew what she was. She also knew, and this was the thing she could not quite set down, that when he had looked at her across this room, above the head of a sleeping child, she had not felt like nothing. That was a dangerous thing to know. She pulled her cloak tighter against the draft from the window and told herself firmly that it did not matter. Somewhere in the lower corridor, a door opened and closed, and she heard his footsteps passing one more time before the castle settled back into silence. What remains? When everything is stripped away. Lady Seraphine arrived on the 4th day, not the 5th. She came with 12 riders, 2 covered carriages, and the particular energy of someone who had spent the journey preparing to be exactly as impressive as she intended. She was tall, dark-haired, with sharp green eyes and the composed bearing of a woman who had been raised, understanding that rooms rearranged themselves around her. Her riding cloak was deep green wool lined with white fur, and she wore it as though it were a throne. Penny saw the arrival from the kitchen yard, where she was carrying a basket of turnips from the root cellar. She watched the carriages pass through the castle gate and felt something settle in her chest. Not grief exactly, but the particular weight of a door closing on a room you had briefly been allowed to stand inside. She went back to the kitchen. Mira left that same morning before Seraphine's retinue had fully unpacked. The escort of 4 royal guards rode out eastward with the girl sitting straight-backed on a gentle brown mare, her riverstone in her pocket, and her new braid slightly loosened but still holding. She had said goodbye to Penny in the castle yard, with the solemn formality of a child who had decided that proper farewells required dignity. "Will you still be here?" Mira had asked. "If I come back someday?" "I will be here," Penny had said. The girl had nodded once, as though filing this away as reliable information, and then had ridden out without looking back. Penny had watched until the small figure disappeared beyond the gate, and then had picked up her basket and walked back inside. That evening, she heard the great hall filled with music and voices, the formal welcome feast for Seraphine's family. The smell of roasted meat and spiced wine drifted down through the castle's passages. Penny worked the kitchen fires late, cleaning and banking them for the night, and did not think about what was happening in the hall above. She almost succeeded. It was Rona who came to find her, 2 days later, with a face carefully arranged into neutrality that told Penny immediately something had happened. "Lord Cassian is back," Rona said. Penny looked up from the bread she was shaping. "He was banished from the castle. He was asked to leave. There is a difference, apparently, that Lord Cassian has decided matters." Rona lowered her voice. "He came with Lady Seraphine's father. They arrived together this morning. There is a meeting in the council chamber." She paused. "Cassian has been telling people things. About the East Wing. About you and the child." She met Penny's eyes. "He is saying you were placed there deliberately. That the king arranged for you to be found with the child, to create a scene that would justify stripping Cassian's lands." The bread dough was cold and dense under Penny's hands. She stared at it. "That is not what happened." "I know that," Rona said, "but Cassian does not need it to be true. He needs it to be believable. And Lady Seraphine's father needs a reason to renegotiate the betrothal terms, because the king dissolved certain trade agreements when he took Cassian's eastern lands, and those agreements benefited the northern coast." She folded her hands. "You are the reason they are offering. A kitchen Omega, who has been spending time in the king's presence, who was in the servants' gallery during a formal audience, who has, in their telling, been maneuvering herself into the king's attention." The kitchen felt very quiet suddenly, despite its noise. "What will happen?" Penny asked. "That depends on the king," Rona said. Penny was not summoned to the council chamber. She was not summoned anywhere. She returned to her work, bread, water, fire, copper pots, and waited with the still patience of someone who has learned that waiting is sometimes the only available action. She was in the herb room off the kitchen, tying bundles of dried thyme, when Gareth Holt appeared in the doorway for the second time in her life. He looked older than he had 2 weeks ago, or perhaps she was simply looking at him more carefully now. "The king wants to see you," Gareth said. "Not here, the study." She followed him up the servants' stair and through the upper corridor without speaking. At the study door, Gareth knocked twice and stepped aside, leaving her to enter alone. The room was the same as the first morning, maps on the table, books on the shelves, fire in the hearth. But the quality of the air was different, tighter, the way air feels before a storm breaks. Valen was standing at the window with his back to her. He wore his full formal leather today, the dark iron buckles, the fur mantle, the bracers at his wrists. His braided hair was fully ordered. He looked like the king, not the man who had crouched beside a child's chair and listened to an honest answer without flinching. "Close the door," he said. She did. He turned. His face was controlled, carefully, deliberately controlled in the way she now recognized as effortful rather than natural. "You have heard what Cassian is saying," he said. "Yes, my king. I need to ask you something, and I need your honest answer. Not the answer a servant gives a king." He paused. "The honest one." Penny met his eyes. "Ask. Do you believe I arranged that night? That I placed you in the East Wing deliberately, to use you?" The question landed in the room and sat there. Penny looked at him, at the tightness around his jaw, the particular stillness of someone who has asked a question they are genuinely afraid of hearing answered wrongly. And she understood that this mattered to him in a way that had nothing to do with politics or council chambers. "No," she said. "I don't believe that." Something released in his face. Brief, real. "Cassian is lying," he said. "But he has an audience willing to believe him, because it is easier to believe that a king acts from calculation than from—" He stopped. "From what?" she asked quietly. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside the window, The wind moved through the castle's towers with a low, mournful sound. The fire crackled. "I was 7 years old," he said, "when my father sent me to foster with Lord Brennan of the Eastern Reaches. I was an alpha child, and he wanted me toughened. Lord Brennan believed in toughening through neglect." His voice was even. The evenness of it was the most expressive thing about it. Cold rooms, insufficient food, the understanding that asking for help was weakness. He paused. "I survived it. But I have never been able to walk past a cold room with a child inside it and keep walking." The fire popped. A log shifted. The sound filled the silence between them. "That is why I came to the East Wing that night," he said. "Not calculation. I heard something. A sound in the corridor. I followed it." He looked at her directly. "And I found you had already done what I would have done." Penny's throat was tight. She kept her voice steady. "Then we were both following the same thing." "Yes," he said. "We were." The space between them felt different now. Not smaller exactly, but less obstructed. As though something that had been standing between them had quietly stepped aside. "There is still the matter of the council," Penny said. "And Lady Seraphine, and what Cassian is telling her father. I know." His jaw set. "I will handle Cassian. I have handled him once already, and I will do so again, more permanently this time." He moved away from the window. "But I need to tell you something first, before I walk back into that chamber and say what I intend to say." He stopped a few feet from her, close enough that she could see the scar at his jaw clearly, the fine lines at the corners of his eyes. "The betrothal to Seraphine was arranged by my council 18 months ago. I agreed because I was told it was necessary. Alliances, trade, the northern coast. I agreed because I had no particular reason not to." He held her gaze. "I have a reason now." Penny's heart was very loud in her ears. "My king, Valen," he said, quietly, firmly. She swallowed. "That is, I am a Kitchen Omega. I have no rank, no family." "I know what you are," he said. "I also know what I watched you do. 3 times now, in 3 different rooms. You have done the most important thing a person can do. You saw someone who needed help, and you helped them. Without calculation, without reward, without anyone watching." He paused. "I have sat in council chambers for 8 years surrounded by people who act only when they are watched. Do you understand how rare you are?" She did not have an answer for that. She was not certain she was breathing correctly. "I am not asking you for anything today," he said. "I am not asking you to decide anything. I am going back into that council chamber to end the betrothal and to remove Lord Cassian from my kingdom permanently. That is my decision, made for my own reasons, and it does not require anything from you." He held her eyes. "But I wanted you to know why, before the room fills with politics again and the reason gets buried under everything else." He moved toward the door. "Valen," she said. He stopped. She had used his name. She had not meant to. It had simply arrived, the way true things sometimes do without asking permission. "I would have done it regardless," she said. "But I am glad that it was your corridor, that it was your castle." She paused. "That it was you who came through the door." He looked at her for a long moment, standing in the doorway of his study with the cold corridor behind him, and the warm firelight in front. And the expression on his face, the one she had never been able to name, finally resolved into something clear. It was the look of a man who had spent a long time in cold rooms and had stopped expecting warmth, and had just now found it somewhere he was not looking. Lord Cassian was escorted from the kingdom of Varenhold before the next sunrise, stripped of his remaining titles and lands, his name struck from the noble rolls by the king's own hand. The process was swift and complete. and carried the particular finality of a decision made by someone who did not intend to revisit it. Lady Seraphine left 2 days later with her father's retinue. She was not, by any visible measure, a woman who accepted disappointment gracefully. But she was an alpha daughter of sufficient pride to carry herself out of Varenhold with her chin level, and Penny, who watched the carriages leave from the castle yard, found herself feeling, despite everything, a distant respect for that. Gareth Holt found Penny in the kitchen on the morning after Seraphine's departure. He stood in the doorway with his arms inside his robes, and his expression carrying the particular texture of a man recalibrating his understanding of how certain things were going to go. "The king has asked," Gareth said carefully, "whether you would be willing to take a position in the upper household, as a senior attendant." He paused. "With appropriate rank reassignment." Master Aldrich, standing at the fire with his ladle, did not look up, but the ladle stopped moving. "I am willing," Penny said, for the second time, in the same words. Gareth nodded. Left. Aldrich stirred the pot again. "You'll be missed in my kitchen," he said gruffly. And then, after a pause, "You'll also be where you ought to be. I have always thought so." She looked at him. He kept his eyes on the pot. She did not push further, because she understood that was the most he would say, and it was already more than she had expected. 6 months later. The snow came early that year to Varenhold, thick and silent, settling over the castle's towers and the yard and the forest beyond the walls in a clean white that made the world look new. The torches in the great hall burned warm against it. The fires in every hearth were banked high. Penny stood at the window of her new chambers, small but hers, with a real fireplace and a proper bed and a view of the inner yard, and watched the snow fall in the early morning dark. She wore a wool dress of deep gray with a blue cloak, properly made, properly warm, the hem not frayed. Her gold hair was braided back from her face with a dark ribbon. She heard his step in the corridor before he knocked. She had learned his footstep the way you learn things you have listened for long enough. He knocked anyway. "Come in," she said. He entered without ceremony. He was in his riding clothes again. He had been out before dawn, which she had also come to know about him. And his hair was disordered by wind, and his eyes carried that alert, present quality they always had after he had been moving through open air. He crossed the room and stood beside her at the window. They looked at the snow together for a moment without speaking. "Mira sent a message," he said. He held out a small folded piece of parchment sealed with a smear of candle wax pressed with what appeared to be a thumbprint. "With the Eastern Courier." Penny opened it. Inside, in the careful, uneven letters of a child who was learning to write, were the words, "I still have the stone. My mother stopped crying. I practice the braid every day. M." She folded it carefully and held it against her chest for a moment with both hands. "She is well," Valen said. "She is well," Penny agreed. He looked at her profile in the window's cold light. The line of her jaw, the soft gray eyes watching the snow, with the particular attention he had never quite learned to disguise and had stopped trying to. He reached out and took her hand, slowly, with the deliberate care of a man who had learned to move carefully around fragile things and had since learned that she was not fragile, but that careful still mattered. Her fingers closed around his. Outside, the snow continued to fall. It covered the yard and the towers and the roads leading east and west and north and south from Varenhold. It covered the place where Cassian's carriages had rolled away and the place where Seraphine's had followed. It covered the gate through which Mira had ridden with her river stone in her pocket and her chin up. It covered all of it, clean and even and complete. Inside, the fire burned. Inside, 2 people stood at a window with their hands joined, watching the world go quietly white, and neither of them said anything for a long while because nothing needed to be said. What had been broken had been named. What had been cold had been warmed. What had been invisible had been seen, fully, clearly, without calculation or ceremony, and had chosen to stay. The kingdom of Varenhold would have its queen, not a daughter of alliances or the architecture of politics. Not a woman offered as collateral on a deal struck in a council chamber by men who measured value in trade routes and titles. A woman who had carried a tray up a cold stair and knocked on a door. Who had lit a fire in a room no one had remembered to warm. Who had sat beside a frightened child and made the world smaller and safer with nothing but her presence and her steady hands. Valen turned from the window and looked at her, not with the expression of a king assessing, but with the open, unguarded look of a man who has found what he did not know he was missing, and said her name. Just her name. Penny. As though it were enough. As though it were everything. She looked back at him and smiled, and it was,